The most advanced defense systems on Earth all depend on something most people never think about. Not software, not missiles, not AI, but a metal. The Lockheed Martin F-35 Lightning II, built by Lockheed Martin and supported by key systems from Northrop Grumman, rely heavily on titanium. So does America's expanding defense frontier in space through the United States Space Force. But here is what's starting to get attention. A single system in North America, linked to Saga Metals, contains a 3-kilometer strike zone of titanium bearing mineralization. Early indications suggest it could represent one of the most significant titanium systems identified on the continent. And if that scale holds, it changes everything, because now this is no longer just about aircraft or satellites. It's about whether the materials behind air and space dominance are actually secure at all. Today we are joined by Mike Steer of Saga Metals, and we're going to break down what this discovery means and why critical minerals like titanium are becoming central to modern defense. Mike, it's great to have you on. I remember meeting you when I was up in Canada at your office, discussing some of the adventures that you guys are going on. But this one is actually very different, because most people think of defense systems as engineering and software, but underneath it all, the physical materials. So how critical is titanium when it comes to platforms like the F-35?
Yeah, and first off, Gary, thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it. Titanium is extremely critical to the F-35. It's one of the foundational materials that makes the jet's fifth generation performance and survivability even possible. Titanium enables the F-35 to meet aggressive weight, maneuverability, and range requirements without excessive compromises like heavier components that would hurt agility and fuel efficiency. From a survivability standpoint, you can imagine that something moving that fast will generate significant heat. But the titanium components can reach temperatures over 1100 degrees Fahrenheit while maintaining structural integrity. So, if you will, titanium isn't nice to have stealth or avionics techs. It's the material that lets the F-35 be light enough, tough enough, and hot zone capable enough to meet its multi-role and multi-variant requirements. So think of it as like a high-performance skeleton that allows it to function in the manner that it needs to at that peak level. And so supply chain concerns around titanium, especially high-quality aerospace-grade titanium, have even drawn national security attention precisely because it's so indispensable to programs like the F-35.
So how much titanium is actually in an F-35, and what role does it actually play in performance and survivability?
Yeah, so it represents about 33%, I believe, in the F-35.
Wow.
The F-35, yeah, Lightning II. And so, again, it's not the whole entire aircraft is obviously not made up of titanium, but it's put in very strategic parts and components throughout the fighter jet so that it can perform at that peak level.
Okay, so we tend to think of fighter jets and space systems as separate worlds, but President Trump started the United States Space Force in his first term. It's now a core part of the U.S. defense strategy. Are we actually looking at a shared dependency here where both air and space systems rely on the same material base like titanium?
Yes, air and space systems under the Department of War, including fighter jets like the F-35 and U.S. Space Force platforms, share a deep strategic dependence on the same constrained material base, with titanium as a prime example. So there's not separate worlds. They draw from the same limited pool of high performance aerospace grade material. Where supply is geopolitically constrained, you've got import dependence, and an increasing strain by competing demands from, not just those applications, but commercial aviation, military aircraft, satellites, and launch vehicles.
So this brings up the bigger question: if supply chains, I mean, everyone's talking about it ever since COVID, really. That was when people really understood how critical they are, and when they fail, the worst happens, right? I mean, from a consumer standpoint, everybody was worried about going to Costco to get their toilet paper. But this is a much bigger national security issue, because we're talking about the core materials that actually function in the defense industry. And of course, we're in the middle of the situation in Iran. It looks like things are starting to die down. President Trump is currently in negotiations with China. They're talking about supply chain things there. So if supply chains for titanium or other critical inputs tighten, does that create a ripple effect across multiple defense programs?
Yeah, absolutely. Tightening supply chains for titanium creates documented ripple effects across multiple U.S. defense programs, and the overall system is more fragile than many outside the industrial base realize. These are not isolated risks; they stem from shared, highly concentrated global dependencies that affect, fighters, missiles, satellites, submarines, and hypersonics simultaneously. Like, specific to the F-35. There were supply disruptions following the post 2022 Russian sanctions and related lawsuits with Lockheed Martin versus Howmet, over titanium parts pricing and cutoffs, which threatened production timelines and contributed to broader strain. Then you've got supply bottlenecks directly related to munitions and 2025 report warning of threats to missile production. These materials are the quiet foundation linking air, space, sea, and missile programs, and it's a matter of national security and defense supply chains, which must be strengthened.
So how much of our dependence is outside of the domestic United States or North America?
Um, well, all of it really. Like the current supply
Wow.
chain for high grade, titanium and related materials is very fragile, right? Like you have the U.S. currently does not have a domestic supply of titanium sponge material. It's 100% import reliant.
Okay, so I may be jumping ahead here, but right now you guys have found something that is domestic titanium, one of the largest titanium veins on the continent. Can you elaborate on just how important that is right now? Because what you just revealed is that we're at the mercy of the rest of the world. I mean, we know that President Trump, he has a new minerals initiative, the critical minerals a vault, Project Vault as he calls it, is also being established. But with respect to, they've already identified the national security threat through these supply chains. But what you just told me, I mean, we're a sitting duck as a nation if we have to rely on other nations for the titanium that our own military relies on. We're screwed. But you guys have something you've discovered.
Yeah, and again, we've obviously slowly moved towards this globally centric industrialized supply chain. Starting back 30 years ago when China basically decided that they wanted to dominate. Not only the exploration and development of mining operations, but also processing. And so we kind of naturally progressed to this without really realizing the potential implications that could have. And we've obviously seen that more recently with geopolitical tensions and some of these countries showing their willingness, to use these as tools, as weapons, more from a geopolitical standpoint to cut off and create these bottlenecks or choke points within the supply chain. And so, for Saga Metals, we created this diversified portfolio of critical mineral assets within North America, specific to shoring up our supply chains and national defense towards some of these specific raw materials that go into these very, very important and strategic, downstream end use products that we not only use from an everyday standpoint as consumers, but also within the governments and defense departments.
It's amazing because I've never considered this. I've been covering news and politics for 20 years, and this is now just coming on my radar, and I feel like I'm really late to the party on this. So I'm glad that we have an administration that is recognizing the significance and the need to basically onshore these solutions. I mean, we hear a lot about the military capability, but none of it exists without this industrial base behind us. So how secure is the current supply chain for high-grade titanium and related materials, and where are the pressure points? Because you mentioned that it's outside of the nation, but can you kind of drill down more?
Yeah, I mean, again, the current supply chain for high grade titanium and related materials is very fragile. It's not secure. The U.S., remaining 100% reliant on imports for titanium. The foundational material for these titanium alloys that feeds into F-35 bulkheads, Space Force satellite structures, missiles, hypersonics, with no domestic commercial production since the last plant closed in 2022. So, the USGS data from 2025 shows that the US imported approximately 44,000 tons of titanium material, and the global capacity is just highly concentrated in an adversarial and or geopolitically exposed sources. As an example, I already mentioned Russia being one of the largest suppliers of aerospace grade titanium, and so it is it's no pun intended, but it's very critical that North America takes this seriously, and make sure that we either have domestic sources that can feed specifically into these industries, or shoring up your allegiances and your alliances more so than we've ever done in the past.
Now, you mentioned something happened in 2022. The last plant shut down. Can you elaborate on that? What exactly happened there?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, it was that was in 2020.
Oh,
Again,
2020, excuse me.
yeah. So, I think that what occurred in some of those situations, especially back then, obviously going 6 years from now, is that at that particular moment in time when you didn't have governments paying attention, or administratives trying to help feed into these specific industries, costs, you can obtain those sources from outside the country, at just more efficient cost manner. Why obviously, like, why would you pay more? That's kind of why most of processing and everything like that has kind of left North America over the last 2 3 decades. But we're kind of now realizing that that's a pretty big mistake, right? And we got to bring all that back.
So we're now seeing growing levels of U.S. government funding flowing into critical mineral rare earth projects. In just the last quarter, close to 10 deals have been reportedly completed across different government departments to strengthen these domestic supply chains. So does that signal that Washington finally understands the scale here, the vulnerability, and could projects like Saga potentially sit directly in the path of that capital rotation?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely clear there's a surge in U.S. Government funding, deals for critical minerals and rare earth projects. Signaling that Washington now treats the strategic vulnerability as a core national security priority. Concrete actions across multiple departments, including Department of War, Department of Commerce, Department of Energy, Export Import Bank. We've seen bilateral frameworks between the U.S. and Australia for critical minerals. As you already mentioned, the announcement of Project Vault, which is allocating over 10, I think it's $12 billion towards critical mineral initiatives. The Pentagon signaling its support for companies like MP Materials. Things are happening, but things need to keep happening if we truly want to shore up, supply and national defense.
So let's bring this right into Saga Metals itself, because you're sitting on a system with a 3 kilometer titanium bearing strike zone. Explain what that is, and where does this fit into the broader push for supply security, and what stage are we really at in understanding its full scale?
Yeah, for sure. And just to back up a little bit, in terms of that just over 3 kilometer strike, um, we actually technically have a 20 plus kilometer strike. It just
Oh,
so
wow.
happens that we are currently conducting our maiden mineral resource estimate drill program over a highly concentrated 3 kilometer stretch of that broader 20 kilometer strike. So as you can imagine, that's quite a large area. And so we're endeavoring currently to put an indicated resource, which is your notch above an inferred resource, that just more quantifies the actual tonnage and concentrate of the titanium, and it also happens to have byproducts of vanadium and iron in the system. But nevertheless, this is a very significant magnetic anomaly that we've identified through geophysics across the property, soil samples, grab samples, and now having drilled almost 14,000 meters,
Wow.
most of which is in that 3 kilometer strike that you mentioned before, which we've named the Trapper Zone. And so, coupled with the significant infrastructure that surrounds this project, being, not 20 kilometers away from tidewater and a deep sea water port, we think that this is the type of project that can be fast tracked into production. And we're just moving it through those development stages to be able to signal and reach that goal. And of course, we still obviously have a bit more work to do, but given the significance of titanium as a national security, national defense item, we are endeavoring or aiming to prove that this could feed into that system. And so we'll be aggressively working towards that, obviously for the remainder of 2026 here with this drill program and the mineral resource estimate, and then into 2027 and beyond.
So what's the realization of getting it out of the ground, like the timeline realization from getting it out of the ground into the hands of the defense industry itself? Like what does that timeline look like?
I mean, it's kind of the same for any of these things. I mean, the current short term, in production downstream aspects of, seeing an F-35 fighter jet get built and then take off into the sky, that's all currently within this constrained supply chain that we have. So we have to look, 3, 5, 10 years down the line and understand that if we don't do something today to shore up, domestic supply of this, that when we get to those markers, 5 to 10 years down the line, we're still in that same constrained environment, relying on other countries that could choose to turn off the tap at any point in time. So again, we obviously have a bit more to do on the development side of things. Our goal is to put out this mineral resource estimate within the next, call it 6 months, with obviously the metallurgical aspects of the specific minerals that can allow us to be able to define and say that this can feed into that system. Production and all the rest of it obviously comes with a bit of time after that. But again, we have to do these things now if we want to meet, internal domestic supply security in more of the short term.
Yeah, that's remarkable to think about, how much foresight you have to have because of the time that it takes to investigate, to get the samples, to understand it, and then, from A to Z, you have to have a serious team. And from an investor standpoint, do you think the market's fully pricing in the strategic importance of critical minerals yet, or is this still an underappreciated sector?
Yeah, I mean, I would say in the last 9 months or so, we've started to see some of that get priced in, but definitely not to the full extent of what it should be. I mean, I still think that people just think it's perhaps a buzzword, or it's just something that is kind of the flavor of maybe the latter part of 2025 and into 2026. But as I mentioned before, the reality is that the situation is much more serious than people realize, and the term critical minerals is not going away anytime soon. And so, as far as Saga Metals is concerned, and our current market capitalization, I'd say it's not fully priced in for sure.
What was your reaction when you heard about the Project Vault that President Trump was initiating?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously being a Canadian-based project. I think for us, it was very exciting. I mean, I think Canada and the U.S. are obviously figuring out our ties together, but I think it's something that will never go away. We're neighbors. We got to work together. We have for decades. It's not going to stop, and I think seeing that is again a great sign for the critical mineral industries. And Canada's done some similar things in terms of initiatives to support these critical mineral projects. And this is what we have to do in North America. We got to work together. We need to have these programs in place to advance these projects if we want to take this seriously and actually secure our supply of these very important, very critical materials.
So when you zoom all the way out, we're talking about fighter jets, space systems, entire defense infrastructure networks, all depending on just a narrow set of minerals. So what's the real takeaway here? Is this ultimately a mining story? Is it a national security story that most people just haven't fully understood yet?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's the latter. You know, again, back when we founded Saga Metals, we set it up as a diversified critical mineral portfolio with projects that stem across a multitude of different critical minerals to feed directly into this national security supply chain initiative and national defense. And so, you know, yes, it always boils down to having an exploration project that comes into a mining operation, but that's just what you're doing day to day. What's the bigger, broader picture? It is feeding into that broader narrative.
All right, Mike Steer, Saga Metals, I appreciate you joining us, because if there's one takeaway here, it's that modern defense is not just built on technology, it's built on access to the materials that make advanced systems possible. And we haven't even had a chance to discuss your recent acquisition of the Garneo titanium project, a project wrestled from the hands of the billion-dollar mining giant Rio Tinto, strategically positioned alongside one of the largest titanium mines the world's ever known. But that's a conversation for another day.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me on, Gary. I really appreciate it.
All right, Michael, look forward to having you back. So, what a year it's been already for Saga Metals, and of course we've only scratched the surface. If you want to find out more, hit the link in the description. I know I learned a lot today. Did you?